No? Good? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm David. And, okay, this is my talk, Log All the Things, or at the request of my operations team, log all the things, basically. They wanted more memes. Right. So, good logs. They're going to save you. They're going to save your application, and they're just going to make your life a lot easier. And tests are good. Integration tests are good too, but logs are really just going to save you. Logs are like that superhero that guides you along the path to just to set you free. I do love this meme. I had to jam it in somewhere. So, but there's always something else to fix. It's like, yeah, I'd love to work on getting this bit fixed, but we always are under pressure. There's something else on the list, and it drops down. All the nice-to-have features that we've kind of like missed from the last release. And logging, because it kind of relies on the operations side as well as the developer side, you need to have a bit of coordination between the two. So it kind of slips through the cracks. But I want you to, at least think about it after this talk, have a few ideas about how you can make a few improvements to your logs, and you can just have just a bit more out of them. Now, I think this is tech debt. If you don't know what your app is doing, how do you know it's doing it well? You can write all the tests in the world, and it just means nothing. We treat all kinds of things like tech debt, like things like poor names of functions or variables, or just lack of test coverage. And all of that is really just about getting green screens. I'm just in a competition with Henry trying to get more recursives on screen at one time. So, photographer, could I have a photo of myself with myself, with myself? Thank you very much. Brilliant. So, basically, we want to have some way to measure it, to go, well, are we doing a better job in terms of our tech, logs as tech debt? And I'm just going to throw out just a few things in terms of setting some goals, because usually most of the time, if you're going to, in a job, you're going to go, oh, we've got this tech debt, right? What is it? How do we measure it? You want to have a way to say, we've made this better because we've done these things. So can you read your logs? Like, are you actually logging correctly? Are you able to search and filter them? Can you just take your whole stream of data and search it? And it could just be grep. That's all you need. Or are you actually dumping it out to another system where you can search and filter, like, Elasticsearch or Logstash and Kibana and Grafana and all the likes? Can you respond to your logs? Can you get monitoring off of your logs when things start going wrong, or you get a few warnings, or how good is that in terms of your application or applications? Can you calibrate them? If you get a spike in traffic, or if you get a spike in something, or something goes a bit dodgy, can you go, actually, I want to switch this off, or I want to switch more on this side? And if you feel you've got a real handle on your logs, can you actually unify them across various applications that you have and various services? Can you follow something flowing from one end of some pipeline to another? And these are really just like baselines in terms of making it, setting some ground rules for, I want to work on my logs, make them better. Now, this is going to be developer focused. I had to choose between my favorite bearded developer. Was it Bruce or was it John McCarthy? So I put both in. We're not even going to start talking about the operations side of, like, Elasticsearch or, Grafana, or choosing one over the other. This is just about what you're going to do inside your application. So whatever stack you have is just going to define the kind of things you can actually do. If you're very restricted, well, you're going to be restricted, pretty much everything. Things like Kubernetes or Docker, most people are trying to work with the sort of 12-factor app approach, where it's very simple in terms of just print out to standard out, and that's it. The systems on the other end, like daemons, will take care of shipping the logs to another system. And I do like that simplicity. Buying versus building is another thing I'm not going to really talk about. If you want to, go out and buy something like New Relic or some other system where everything's rolled up for you, it's great because you're going to get a lot of things, pretty much from the start, like the monitoring, being able to filter and search without too much. But sometimes people worry about, are there overage fees, or is it, how much data am I going to ship to them, and is it going to cost me a fortune? It's great if you're a unicorn company, you can just throw money out, out the window. Not everybody is. Okay, so in terms of development, there are certain things we just can't avoid, really. These are some of the things over time I've seen on various projects, and it's not. Other people have different opinions of things. Just these are some observations I've seen. Failure is always an option. Just no matter which way you structure your application, there's always going to be something that fails at some point. And again, this doesn't have to be it's going to fall over and never recover. Your application could have things built into it to recover, but sometimes your logs are there to really show you that things are, what's happening, why it's happening, and it gives you, just the notifications mainly of what's going on. Weird is normal. There are times even it's not just failure, but just something blips, or you're just getting weird data from somewhere else. You're pulling in some stuff. Logs, again, just logging this information out in a good way can, save you a lot of time and effort debugging the whole system. Just seeing the events. Embracing change, logs are brilliant for this as well. If you just switch on a few new features, being able to see the live logs as you start up the system and be able to follow what's going on just can save you, so much worry, and it makes it easier to make changes over time. Now, logs, don't want to think of them as transactional. You want to be prepared to lose messages out of your log system. We're hoping it's a tiny proportion of messages. I mean, tiny, tiny, tiny proportion. But if this is important data, really you should be putting it into something else besides just logging it. It would be in a database. And as well, not everyone's going to keep the data over, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Maybe some people will, or just pare it down and keep a rougher set of data. So you treat it like important data, but it's not mission critical data in the sense that if you lose this, everything goes wrong. Probably something is going wrong if your logs are going missing. That should be a clue. All right, this one of our operations team was like, oh my gosh, I've never heard a developer actually say this. If you're logging things out, just use UTC. Just don't be doing time zones ever. Your servers should be set up with UTC, and that's it. Around sort of UK, Ireland, we don't really deal with it except for that bit in summertime. But other sides of the world, it's a bit more convoluted. UTC will do it for you. And if you can, try and use a decent ISO format for your dates. None of that American fancy stuff that confuses people. Right. So one thing I've noticed a bit recently I quite like is structural logging. Now, most people are probably familiar with that. Now, everything's wrapped because it's just, so long. I suppose a lot of people are familiar with the top line in terms of a log statement. Hands up, who's sort of familiar with that general Java kind of? Yeah, it's a bit boring. Whereas if you're going to move that onto another system, what you need to do is you need to have something that pulls that data, parses each part of it, and is going to reconfigure it into something to send it into a system. One thing I do like, and I've seen a few times recently, is your whole message, your log message, is a data structure, a nicely nested data structure. Now, okay, I've pretty printed it here onto a few lines, but that would just be one line of data. Now, I'm lying a bit there because That's lovely, lovely Eden on the bottom. One line as an event, but JSON won. I didn't really want to have to put up this slide, but JSON won the internet. And if you're going to be dealing with most log systems out there that capture your logs and put them into something, you're going to want to print your data out in that format. Now, for most of the log libraries out there, there is a way to just go, oh, yes, here's a JSON object for each log message, which is quite handy. So another lovely thing that I've seen quite recently is trying to keep consistency across all of your log events. That using something like, an event or an action for each log message. So if you're doing, one line is one data structure that's being sent out, and there's always a relatively consistent key to say this is the one for opening the pod bay doors. That you can find it in your when you're filtering your logs in a much easier fashion. Always having that, and again, in Clojure, namespaces are great because you can just, know what namespace in your code you're dealing with, because it's right in the name of the, in the keyword as you're generating it. So that's one that's really, really good. And just having that telling a story rather than just dumping out various data in different shapes, at least having a few keys or a few bits of the data in a very similar fashion is great and can really help filter your logs. Other things, just the application context, what is actually sending out the information is very handy to have. The application version will be great for when you are trying to do rolling updates, or you just want to see, did it make a difference to some other system? Multiple instances of the application, having the node, whatever, and feature flags. What have you turned on? What thing is going to affect your application? All these just, once you start thinking of your log message as just one data map instead of that boring string of, the namespace and blah, all these things start becoming ideas that you can put into your log message that you can send to your other system, and you can start filtering and getting a bit more of an idea of your, what you want to do with your logs, because you can do a lot of stuff with it. It's great. Again, if you're doing a web service or something, and each request that comes in, you probably want to be able to follow that request from the start to the end, and usually finding something like a user ID or even generating your own UUID or something to pass through every part of your application, every function that you are calling, so that each log message could have that kind of, that coherency across them. That's another thing that I've really seen recently that has helped. Okay, stack traces. Who's seen those absolutely terrible 200-line bits of logs that just destroy your whole log? Don't do it. Let's just stop doing the print stack tracer log/error meh. There is a great library out there from Avisa, Pretty, that will just basically take your exception and at least filter it down into a structure. It is just a data structure. And you don't care about the 200 lines. You care about a few bits in between. You care where in your code it failed, and probably some of the Clojure bits and maybe some other places. This library I find it quite helpful for this. It can be hard to read at the very start. Usually when I'm dumping things out, I'll turn off the font stuff, the ASCII fonting stuff. It's just, it's going to ruin the JSON output for me. But it will give you a style of, at least a Clojure style data structure where you can have data on your exceptions. Now, this brings me on to one point. If you are going to be throwing exceptions in your Clojure application, use exception info. This is great, that you can send data back up to, so in this case here, where the properties are, have I got that? Probably can't see that now. just here with the X data, this is the property data that in the next slide, that would be that kind of, all that map after the exception message would be found in that part of the code. And it's great for just passing back up the stack. Here's why it failed. Here's how it, here's the data that caused it. And you will also get in the stack trace the map of the lines of data. It's just ready for printing out to a log message in a data form. So that's one thing. I can't recommend it enough. Just instead of just throwing a boring exception, doing this will save you a fair bit of time. Uncaught exceptions. This is one that just do it at the start of your application. And yes, Haskell people, please don't troll us. That there are places where exceptions might happen and we haven't even thought of them. I'm sorry, I didn't design the language. But just being able to catch anything that bubbles up through the various thread pools that you have on your system, it will just save you a bit, and just logging it out is brilliant. Shutdown logging. Don't rely on this, but it is great if you are going to be bringing your app up and down instead of the, say, Docker or Kubernetes. It just gets killed and a new one comes up. There are no guarantees on this, and especially if you get killed, say, in Kubernetes or places, it could be a kill -9 and you will not see anything. But it's just some people don't really know about it. Okay, with apologies to XKCD, JVM. There are just so many different libraries out there to use. Most of them are based on the JVM itself, on Java, not Clojure specific. Now, does anybody want to own up? Who actually just does the class loading, logging, as in, there's something on the class, it logs stuff, and that's what happens. Because I've done that before. I've just been lazy and just gone, oh, this library brings in, log4j or log back, and it's really just, it's probably not the best thing in the world. And especially if you're bringing in lots of other libraries and you have a massive project that's CLJ, having this first usually wins approach to your logging, it's something that maybe just think about it. Do you really want to use that library just for, forever, or do you want to, move to something a bit different? Don't let another library choose your logging for you. If you find there are multiple ones in the project dependencies, it's probably a good time to clean up your dependencies by, if you add pedantic warn to your project CLJ, depending on the size of it, you might be horrified, and start cleaning it up. Require your library early enough, and if you can, exclude the others. And maybe you need some bridging libraries to cover cases where other libraries you rely on will just log, and you want to suppress them. All right. Most of the JVM libraries out there, there's some kind of properties files or environment variables that you need to set to do all the logging, like the appenders and the rolling appenders and the different levels and the format and all that. Can anybody actually remember one of these by heart? I mean, I can't. I just, every time, what I end up doing is like, just go to the internet, look at the documentation, or look on Stack Overflow. Somebody's got an example. It seems like it's okay for me. Yeah, I'll give up now, and I'll move on to the next task that's on my list. But most of the time, all we want to do is print the standard out, and then it's an ops problem after that. Ops were okay with this slide. They're happy with that. And again, the 12-factor approach of just printing the standard out and just letting something else take care of it, not having it in-app, of all the rolling appenders, the truncating appenders. All these things are complicated, and they just add a bit more places where your app might fail. And by printing to standard out, if your app falls over or burns down in mysterious circumstances, you might still be able to get some log messages out. If you've got some system in the background that's going to be pumping things out to another service, if your app just falls over, all bets are off. Now, if you If your logs are working and you got one of the old JVM log libraries, good for you. And I'm not here to say to you, you got to rip it out and start again. But if you are using one of them, I hope you're using Clojure tools logging to do your logging within Clojure, because it's an abstraction over it. And one of the best things that it has is macros for log statements. If you've turned off debug, it won't run. It will just, it won't evaluate the body, which is great. But we're in Clojure land, and most of the time we want code as data. Now, this is one, and I do apologize to all the francophones who are just sitting right in front of me here. I'm going to say timber. I know it's, in French it'll be like slightly different. It's just 3 days away. I've used this, and it seems to work, and is relatively sensible in terms of its defaults. It also has some Clojure script version in the same library, which is brilliant, and it's all code. So, again, it's pretty much like the other one, log debug, and it's ready to go. Now, I am running short on time, as Abby has pointed out. So, configuring it, it's rather obvious, I find. The documentation is in the code, and you can just you can work with it at the REPL, which is just, it saves me a lot of time. I can experiment as I go to change the format. There's also, you can, in terms of Timber, you can elide logs at the compilation level. You can take that piece of code, and it's never in the final compiled version, by setting the log level as environment variables. You can still do it. You can still set them just at runtime, and it will do the log elision as a macro. All right. This is rather large, but this is how I have done the configuring this to print out a JSON string in terms of a log message. I've set my times, UTC, that's all great. But I've just taken most of the bits, and I've just made them into a nice big JSON, into a nice big map, and done a JSON generate around it. And if there is an error, I'm using the pretty library to just generate the error and have a look at it. Now, there's something hidden down in the bottom there called clean keys. So when I say log all the things, I don't actually mean log all the things. There are a lot of times when there's sensitive information that you're just dumping out. You're dumping a request, passwords, AWS keys, all that stuff that if it is on Elasticsearch and you didn't set up, password protection in front of it, it could be out for all to see. Timber has some middleware available to it where you can just say, put this function in between, and it will operate over your data set. And I've just done this. It's very simple. If I ever see the keyword password, just dissociate from the map, move on to the next, just walk the whole data structure. Now, if you're controlling the whole thing, don't start putting JSON in JSON. It's just going to ruin your day, and you probably don't want to do that. And one thing that I want to leave you with, I'm pretty much wrapping up now, is that there's a guy called Frankie Sardo, a few of you know him. He wrote a blog post about logging, and as usual, he probably does a better job than me most of the time. There's some great nuggets in there. I highly recommend that you read it. And it's just about simplifying your logging. And one thing that he did mention was that sometimes you just want to have a basic logging function. You don't need the whole library. And the blog post by Frankie does go through that. So I think you should log all the things. You decide what your logs are going to do. I'm not trying to tell you to use this format. This is one way that I've found has been quite good. You should try and simplify it. Take a look at the JVM libraries if you're still using them. Do you want to have a better log system? And most of the time people say, oh, we might not have the spare capabilities in terms of CPU or I/O. Most of the time you do, and it will save you in the long run, being able to just filter your events or see why things are slow. Log events, not just raw data. It's just easier to filter this information on the other side and annotate them to try and tell a story. And this will make your life easier. thanks very much for listening to me. Has anyone got any questions for me?
I think often you have this debug logging,
Yes.
and that's turned on very rarely. But usually people calculate strings that would be logged if you have debug turned on, and sometimes quite expensively, and then throw them away. And being functional, of course, in Clojure, it would be interesting how to avoid this situation.
Sure. How to avoid the heavy computation. In terms of this, in terms of the middleware of doing a clean keys, what I've done before is that as I'm walking this data structure, you can also do, sorry, if you'll notice here, there's a lot of places where it's doing force of values, and Timber is, there's delays on most things, so you wouldn't need macro magic. You could, in this piece of code, just basically force the data structure later, at the point where you want it, or use macros. So Clojure tools logging and Timber, there's macro elision of it. So if it's all in that structure, in the log message, the body may not be calculated until it's actually written. So, Matthew?
Hi.
Hey.
You've mentioned to structure your logs, and you also briefly mentioned Elasticsearch. I just wondered if the two things were correlated. Do you have a view on whether the logs should be systematically sent to Elasticsearch? Should it be all the logs or certain events? Is Elasticsearch the ultimate log receiver, and especially it works well with structured data? So
Yeah, Elasticsearch on a previous project we used that as part of our log system. Like Logstash, a lot of the logging systems, it's Elasticsearch based. I can't speak for every single one of them, but some people have used I think Cassandra and a few other things in terms of they are write heavy. In terms of filtering the messages, I think the best thing to do is not even on the node or on the application node, to just ship everything off of it. Don't try and filter, and disk space is quite cheap. You can probably just go afterwards, here's all the data, and actually now I care about this piece of data, because over time you may not know if you need it. And yeah, but beyond Elasticsearch, I haven't really used any of them, that much as log systems.
So, any other questions? So I think, while I've got the microphone, so I think you've touched on, I think you've answered this, David, but I just want to double check. So I think somebody else asked what, often debug's turned off. So would one of your suggestions be leave everything set on, so effectively stream your debug messages out if you're using something like some kind of log gathering analytics tool at the other end?
Yeah, like if you have the spare capacity to log it, I'd say do it. I mean, most people are just worried about that, like, oh, there's not, like, in terms of we're CPU bound or we're IO bound. Are you really? Are you just, a bit trying to be, parsimonious at the start? But just putting everything to debug. If it's an actual debug statement in terms of a huge let block, and I'm just going debug this, debug that, that's probably something you don't really care about in your final logs. But the events of I'm going out to the outside world and I'm getting some data from that system over there, you'd probably want that just as an event in it. So I wouldn't filter beforehand. I'd just sort of send everything out and let operations deal with the data cost. So.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you very much. I think we've got another break.